Paul Hamilton and George P. Bauer regarding the location of Fort St. Joseph. Paul Hamilton is a well-known Indian and the great-great-grandson of Potawatomi Indian Chief Leopold Pokagon. This recording was made on December 2nd, 1976 in Paul Hamilton's home, and as we listen in, George Bauer says,
very friendly fellow, but he invited him in to get something to eat. Well, as they went in, the Indian ordered, said, order whatever you want to. Great big double steak. And the dyspeptic white negotiator ordered a bowl of milk and some toast. So after the Indian had enjoyed his meal, the negotiator said, "Gee, I wish I had your appetite." And the Indian said, "White man, you've taken my money, my land." What are those things that he said he took, Paul? Remember?
Oh, you took my land, you took my money, you took places that I went to, fish, and you took everything that I ever owned. Now you want my appetite.
Paul, I have here a picture, which is an original picture that is down in the library. And this is painted by your son, Patrick Zimmerman. Grandson, yes. And he is now see if I got the grades right.
Yes.
The great-great-great-grandson of Leopold Pokagon.
Right.
And you are the great-great-grandson of Leopold Pokagon.
Yeah.
Now, didn't you and Ruth and I some time ago talk about who's going to carry on after we're gone? And you agreed on whom?
Well, there'll probably be the boy that Pat, that you gave the pictures to, and he'll probably carry on.
Good. And that's the way you want it, isn't it? So he will
Well,
be...
He's the only one that's really interested in our people, and it's going to take some drilling, some teaching to so that he would find out all the stuff about what went on, you know.
Well, you have already given him some of that. He was sitting here at your feet not too long ago, as I was too. We were talking about Fort St. Joseph and the St. Joseph Mission.
Yeah.
And he has volunteered to paint for our library down here a picture of these patereros, small cannon, that were seen by Charlevoix in 1721, and a picture of the fort as you have described to me 4 times. Now, I've sent some things to him, and my concept of what you said, 4 times you have told me about this fort, and 4 times you have described it exactly the same. Now, in one of your documents, now you know, Ruth, this is a disgrace. This history of the early Potawatomi Indians was published in Niles in 1971. Now, you researched this article for print near 7 years, didn't you, Paul? And you're a man of education. you learned to type at Haskell Institute, didn't you?
Yes, and later at the high school,
Which high school?
Dvorak High School. I learned to type at the Dvorak High School first, and I went to Haskell Institute, and I learned more about typing there when I finished at Haskell. So I got to be a pretty good typist when I left Haskell.
Now, in this, you gave several clues to the exact and correct position of Fort St. Joseph. And your Uncle Andrew Rapp used the term that the Indians used for Fort St. Joseph. Now, Fort St. Joseph, as I visualize it, and as Pat is going to paint it, had within it the second St. Joseph Mission. Now, correct me, Paul, if I'm wrong on this, and this is why there's so much confusion here. Are you recording? According to your lecture notes here, which have your family tree, which are duplicated and down at the library, with many, many of your ancestors going way, way back, I believe into the 1700s, maybe later, earlier. Now, you've got some notes in the back of that, and one of them I think is around 1820. Now, am I right that that was the time when the Iroquois, the friends of the English, ran the Potawatomis out of this area up into Wisconsin?
Yeah. The Potawatomis, they just left more or less. It was during a hunting time, you know, and they didn't stay here anyway during the hunting season because it was too cold, so they had to find a different place to stay while it was cold to make their homes.
Now, while they were in Wisconsin, this great French missionary named Eloise, which I suspect comes from the French word louer, meaning to praise, and this is the second person plural, meaning you who praise God. Now, he baptized your people up there as Catholics. And from then on to this very day, the Pokagon band have always been devout Catholics. Even when Leopold Pokagon was working closely for 6 years with Isaac McCoy, who went down across the river from Bertrand and raised a cabin for Leopold Pokagon, because, now you correct me, Paul, if I'm wrong on this, the Indian at that time did not know how to lay logs down. They drove them into the ground and made Waukegans or Kagas or Was, or as the sign down here says, Wongs.
Yeah.
Now, I have to corral a whole lot of things in as short a time as I can, but he went down there and built this place. He made no effort to convert after the Potawatomis had come back, made no effort to convert the Potawatomis to be Baptists. But he did respect and work closely with Pokagon for 6 years. raised that cabin, and in here you have got a Xerox copy of a baptismal record which the Historical Society has in French. And I translated that for you some time ago, remember? Yes. And it was in 1830. And Leopold and his new wife, Elizabeth was the mother of the son Elizabeth was Leopold's second wife, wasn't
Yeah.
she? And Elizabeth was the mother of Simon Pokagon.
Yeah.
And that document that's in the Historical Society records and at the library here in Niles has a signature of the priest who baptized them in this cabin that was raised.
Well,
And you know who sent this priest out from Detroit? Not Vincennes, from Detroit. Was Father Gabriel Richard. You notice his name is on that? And I've forgotten for the moment who the priest was that did the baptizing, but I think you will find on the march of death, as these little children were dying on the way down, and they wanted to baptize them, McCoy's son-in-law, who was conducting tour under military guidance, had such a good relationship with the Potawatomis that he sent back to get this same priest who did this baptizing down here of the children that Leopold Pokagon had given the catechism classes to. Now, some of this stuff is in here, Paul, of the Fort St. Joseph, and the reason I have given so much of this stuff to Casper O'Grethel, one of the pillars of your church, St. Mary's here. You go to St. Mary's, don't you? And Paul, when you feel well enough, you go to St. Mary's, don't you? Monsignor was to give this blessing in America on the 4th of July in English, and Paul in Potawatomi. You know, we did capture that on tape.
yeah.
But unfortunately, I haven't been able to work that tape up yet.
Yeah.
Because you remember Reverend Patton that was here.
Yeah.
And we found out that Paul and he and I all had one thing in common. We'd been married for 47 years. Oh, you've been married?
27.
Oh, you get the kid in.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Paul, I want to read something out of here, and your eyesight isn't possibly what it used to be, so I'll help you. Because what I'm going to read right now, you wrote, and it was published here in Niles many years ago, and it's what your Uncle Andrew said when you walked up to the same place. Now, will you tell us what happened that day when you and Uncle Andrew and your father, Frank Hamilton, walked across this bridge and started up St. Joseph?
Well, there were three of us, and there was three adults and one child, you might say, because Uncle Andrew, a little boy, and my nephew, he was about 10 years old, and we walked down the railroad track And then we came up towards Niles along the railroad track. And I asked Uncle Andrew, I said, where are we going? He says, oh, we're going up here just a little ways. He says, I wanted to show your father a place up here that a lot of stuff is written about it, but it's not accurate. So I want to be sure and tell you fellas just where the place is. And it's a place where the old fort used to stand. And he said they got the fort rebuilt. It stands farther away from here, he says, but it's in the wrong place. He says, here's where it was supposed to be, right here, he says. So I stood right there and just listened to him, and Uncle Andrew, he was quite mad. He said there was nothing that he could do because the Chimookman, the white man, would know where to put that fort, because the Indians, they never got together to tell anybody where the fort really was.
Now, your Uncle Andrew was a brother of your father, Frank Hamilton, wasn't he?
No, he was my mother's brother.
But he was your uncle.
Yeah.
And Frank Hamilton, whose beautiful suit and headdress you are going to permit the Niles Library to put in a case, which will be the real tie-in to Fort St. Joseph. He was standing there that day, wasn't he?
Yeah.
With his, what was it, his cousin, Andrew Rapp, the one that had lost his,
brother-in-law.
Was a little angry about it?
Brother-in-law.
Okay. Now, I'm going to read in Potawatomi, Paul, because your glasses need to be corrected. If you can read it, okay, but if not, with my lousy pronunciation, and you correct me, because the dictionary you and I are getting together have got some phonetic pronunciation of words that I recognize in some of the other languages that I play around with and write in, some of them, like French and Spanish, Latin, Italian, German, Portuguese, and of course Little English. I find a tremendous similarity between them, and I still don't understand it. I find most of all a tremendous similarity between German and the way they jam a whole lot of words together without any breaks. Mm-hmm. And they're exactly the same as they do in the Potawatomi. Mm-hmm. Now, as this dictionary that I started, Paul had started with 163 words, mm-hmm. which I alphabetized and worked from English to Potawatomi. Elgag is a proper term, and Potawatomi to English. Mm-hmm. That dictionary I finally discovered. The answer to a lot of these words which have puzzled people. My daughter has tried to locate, she knows a fellow who's writing his doctor's degree right now on Potawatomi, and she was going to try to find out if she could get a Potawatomi dictionary. But I haven't located one. You don't know of any, do you, Paul?
No, I don't.
Did they have any down at Haskell Institute?
No.
Well, that is at the Potawatomi Reservation, so if they have many places, it certainly would be down there, wouldn't they?
I would think so.
Now, I ran into an astounding thing. on this dictionary. The Indian might use one word, like Waukegan, like Waukegan, Illinois, spelled phonetically several different ways. Or he might say Kaga, as your Uncle Andrew did. Or he might say wall. Or if he's a Frenchman, he'd say, he'd drop off the N and say wong, which is the spelling on the sign down here, which mistakenly is for a river. The Indian had no names for rivers. Is that right, Paul? He had names for certain places on the river. So this thing of Osong, Iwang, CB, Powhatan tells a great big story. And I've written a little article on it, sketched it out, which will explain that.
Yeah.
Now, your term used by Uncle Andrew was Kaga, wasn't it? Now, Paul, you've helped me a great deal on these pronunciations, so let me read what was published here in Niles 5 years ago, when you told them, and very little attention had ever been paid to it, but it was published, wasn't it?
It was.
And you wrote this yourself. You had no help. And you did years of research down here at the library.
Right.
And you typed it with all 10 fingers, not the one finger business. And Paul, I think it's a beautiful thing. That article was in the paper last week about Thanksgiving. Was that taken from here?
No, that was the one that the Cassopas man, the Southern Tribune, interviewed him for.
I know it, but I've read that story someplace on Paul's story of Thanksgiving.
Oh, well, I think he does have something on that.
About 8 years ago, 9 years ago, I wrote that same thing in the Niles paper.
Practically.
Yeah, practically.
Well, I read it someplace.
Yeah.
I've read so many of Paul's things which you have kept. Now, Paul, let me go into this. You walked up the St. Joseph Street, which is preserved in history as a great water trail that went up to the fort, up here at the foot of Lincoln Avenue. But it went on down through the Kankakee, Illinois, Mississippi, to New Orleans. And in the other direction, from the Powhatan, the Great Crossing, it went northeast to the Great Lakes to Montreal. And the Sauk Trail that crossed here, which the people that spoke French would say song instead of Sauk, or sac, had many different spellings. It went up to Copper Harbor. Now, correct me, Paul, if I'm wrong on any of this. Way up into Canada, clear down with its branches to Florida, clear over to the Atlantic with its branches and to the Pacific. And Paul, am I right that this is one of the most important historical and prehistorical sites in America? And that's why it's called the Powhatan. And do you know, Longfellow, in 1855, and I've got a copy of the book here, mentions the Powhatan. He says, from the mountains to the Powhatan. He also mentions on the banks of he used the term Titchy. What's the difference between Titchy and Mitchy? They both mean great, don't they, Paul?
Yeah.
So when they say on the banks of Michigama, what do they mean? Lake Michigan. And where did Hiawatha hang out? Up here in the Hiawatha National Forest area and Tequila. And that's why the first time I ever met Paul and talked into the microphone, I was able to pronounce some of these words, and Paul said they were pretty close. Now let's see how much I've learned since then, Paul. Now, you correct me. Your Uncle Andrew was kind of disgusted with the people putting that big boulder and everything else across the river. I don't know whether it's there then or not. At the wrong place, where there never was a fort. But there was an early mission. The fort on this side of the river was built by order of Frontenac in 1691.
East or west side.
What's that?
You should identify east or west side.
Well, the first mission during the lifetime of Eloise was on the east side of the river, where his cross is.
Right.
The second mission, which is a mother church of St. Mary's here, both of them were, is on the west side, at this place that Paul said. Now the mission was within the fort, wasn't it? And correct me now, Paul, if I'm wrong. Your Uncle Andrew, a little bit disgusted with the stupidity of the people around here who were telling where it was, and yet it had been handed down to him and he handed it down to you. You were 10 years old then, weren't you? In 1912. And he said to you, Katnam Chuna, Chimukiman Wanamu, Chutakaka Stephen, Chutahoy, Chutahoy. How far off am I, Paul?
No.
What did he say, Paul?
Ketnam Jina. Ketnam Jina Judah.
Judah.
I mean in English.
Oh.
Oh, Ketnam Man. That's a shortening for white
Yeah.
man.
Oh.
Judah means near. Kaga means Fort St. Joseph, doesn't it? And Chutahoy means near here, near here. And he was pointing at exactly the same spot that Charlevoix, 255 years ago, in 1721, stood. And he drew a map. And then he said, and Paul's the one who took this out and put in this paper, which nobody's paid any attention to, is the 16th of August, 1721. And he goes on to tell about the fort, and he calls it what it was, a palisades, which is a crude affair. There are, however, some small cannon or gun swivels sufficient to prevent and surprise and hold the savages in check. Now, you remember that cannonball that Bob Lee brought in here one day? About the size of a quarter? And I sent to you some descriptions of that unbelievable father of the machine gun used at Plymouth, Raleigh, and Williamsburg in the 15, 16, and 1700s, and it was a breech loader. You didn't have to get out in front and have somebody shoot you in the back as you run, because you preloaded these cartridges.
Yes.
And you locked them in.
Uh-huh.
Took me 2 months to break down that term, pateraros, until I find the vulgar term that the soldiers call it, and it is pateraros.
Uh-huh.
When I finally got down to Eros, I had the whole story. And you being a lady, I don't think that I will record what the soldiers were thinking about when they named it. Sometime I'm going to tell Paul when you're out of the room. But you'll have to use Greek, French, and Italian, and English, and a knowledge of psychology to be able to understand what that term means. Now, he described it, and of course it was at this particular position. And I hope to see the day when this town will wake up and build a replica of that fort up there where it was.
Right.
Now that fort was a great big thing, or palisade, wasn't it, Paul?
Yeah.
Now what was its shape?
Well, it was about 2/3 of it was on was right together. And the main part where the soldiers went in and was sort of straight across, and it just had one big door. At that time, the doors were just made out of log, wood pieces, poles like, and they were fastened on hinges so they could swing it. They had no iron hinges or anything like that, but the Indians at that time, they knew how to tie the sides together so that the edges together so that they could open them up. See?
How many cannon, Paul?
Well, they didn't have too many cannon. They had about 4 cannon there.
Sometimes they had more and sometimes less.
Well,
Sometimes they had 6 of them, didn't they?
No, they had 4, and they would move them around. You know, they could move them around.
I see. Then there were 6 holes there and 4 cannon.
Yeah.
Oh. Now, that was made up of great, tall tree trunks pointed on the top. But they weren't even. It's kind of jagged, wasn't it, the top?
Yeah, they didn't fix their timbers even. They had them, they were different lengths.
Now, that was about the shape of a half moon, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Now, this is a thing that astounds me, Paul. Every time you and I have discussed it, you make it so much bigger than I had thought it would possibly be. Mm-hmm. Now, in these notes that I have got for your son-in-law, or for your grandson, Patrick Zimmerman, I've talked quite a bit to Pat about this, and he has a grasp of it. Mm-hmm. And I think I sent some stuff to him recently.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I sent it here or over to his home. Mm-hmm. Now, that half moon, which at one time, you see, that fort was there, as nearly as I can research, that fort was there. From its completion, the Indians built it, not the French. The French were there, and they put a very small garrison of 14 men. Because these little cannons required 2 people to operate. Mm-hmm. And this was not completely enclosed, this half moon, was it?
Yes. It could be enclosed. They could shut it up by a big gate that they made, see?
Well, when we talked about it once before, Paul, you pointed out that it went clear around, but on the river bank there was an opening for an escape route. Because the Indian, this was built by the French to fight off the Iroquois in case they came back and started to run them out. And the cannon all pointed away from the river. And they were all small cannon, not the big cannon that people think is down here in the river. That, if found, I suspect will be an English cannon. Now, inside, now you have described this to me 4 times, Paul, and inside you place the mission at one point, the commander's quarters at another, and the soldiers on another. Now, what was the arrangement inside? This was pretty near what? How many feet long?
How large was it?
Yeah.
Well, it covered about, I don't know, half acre, I guess.
You described it to me once before, a couple months ago, that it was almost 800 feet long and pretty near 300 feet wide.
Yeah.
And that the mission... Now, the minute you described this to me several months ago, I knew I had it. A year ago, I had drawn one for Mrs. Freeze on the other side of the river, and I said it couldn't possibly be there. Because the head of Christ, symbolically, would be in the river, and no Frenchman would ever build a fort or a town like that. Now, Ian, and I've seen these places in Europe, you wouldn't recognize it unless you knew what you're looking for. But the towns in Europe, if they're walled or not, are built in the shape of a cross, with the mission, or cathedral, at the north end of a cross, pointed north, with the commander or the king or the prince's quarters on the right-hand bar of the cross. The soldiers on the left hand, and then the followers of Christ on the bottom. Now here is the way I have visualized it, and the way your son, unless you've got some corrections, or your grandson, will draw it for the library. The mission will be inside the fort, at the roughly on the north end, between Lincoln Avenue and St. Joseph. To the right and close to Lincoln Avenue will be the commander's quarters. I notice you're nodding your head, and I hope I'm right thus far. To the left would be the soldiers.
Yeah.
And then toward the bottom and toward the river would be all of the wigwams, longhouses. See, this was a summer fishing camp, wasn't it? This was not the winter quarters, as you described a little while ago. And they would be down with this opening in case the Iroquois approaching